Muy buenas tardes a todos y a todas y muchísimas gracias por venir. Mi nombre es Carmen Jauregui y en nombre de la Red Cultural de la Universidad Gabriela Mistral y del Centro de Estudios Medievales les doy a todos la más cordial bienvenida. Antes de presentar a nuestro invitado estrella, a Thomas Madden, quiero decirles dos palabras acerca de la Red Cultural de la Universidad. La Red Cultural comenzó en el año 2007 de mano de su directora, Madden, con el lema "Más cultura para más personas". Hoy hemos crecido de una manera que ha superado absolutamente todas nuestras expectativas. Han pasado ya por los cursos de Humanidades y Arte cientos de personas. Solo en este semestre tenemos alrededor de 500 personas haciendo estos cursos. Tenemos más de 50 miembros, colegios que son miembros de la red cultural. Tenemos una red educativa, una revista que ustedes han visto cuando han entrado aquí al salón, que nos llena de orgullo, y la oportunidad de traer invitados de gran renombre, como el que nos convoca en esta oportunidad, Thomas Madden, a quien tengo el gran placer de presentar hoy. Thomas Madden es PhD de la Universidad de Illinois, con especialidad en investigación en Europa medieval. Es profesor de Historia y director del Centro de Estudios Medievales y Renacentistas de la Universidad de San Luis, Estados Unidos. Como experto en el tema de las cruzadas, él ha aparecido en medios de comunicación tan importantes como el New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, USA Today, y especialmente, y a lo mejor lo han visto muchos de ustedes, es la persona, el historiador que consulta siempre de History Channel. Él ha recibido varios premios, ha publicado y es editor de más de 10 libros sobre las cruzadas, la Edad Media y la historia de Venecia, temas en los que es considerado un experto mundial. Ayer estuvimos con él en Valparaíso, en la Escuela Naval, y desarrolló el tema "La mujer del mar, la República de Venecia y las cruzadas". Esta mañana, en la Universidad Gabriela Mistral, habló ante académicos, profesores de colegios y de universidad, sobre el tema vida, muerte y resurrección de los templarios. Hoy lo vamos a escuchar hablar sobre las cruzadas y la actualidad, un tema fascinante y muchas veces bastante controversial. Los dejo entonces ahora con el profesor Thomas Madden.
Thank you all for coming this evening. I'm happy to be here to discuss something that is a bit of a rarity in my field of medieval history, which is a topic of timely interest. But that's precisely what the Crusades have become. Since the attacks of September 11th, 2001, just over 10 years ago, the Crusades have been pulled from the pages of history textbooks and spread across the front pages and television screens all over the world, but particularly in America. 10 years ago, in 1999, I wrote one of those textbooks. It was a short introduction to a topic that was taught really in only a few university classrooms around the United States. 2 years later, as Americans struggled to understand why they had been attacked, it left the classroom, the book did, and began appearing on bookstore shelves across the country. And it still remains there. In fact, it's been translated into dozens of languages. Because I was the only living American scholar who had written a book on the Crusades, on September 12th, I found my email inbox full and my phone ringing off the hook with requests for media interviews. I was absolutely petrified when I did my first interview. It was a segment on National Public Radio. But soon after, these interviews became rather routine for me. In the hundreds of interviews that I have given on the subject of the Crusades since then, the questions have usually ended up in much the same place. Are the Crusades, I'm often asked, the root cause of the struggle between Islam and the West today? In other words, how were the Crusades really to blame? And are they to blame? Osama bin Laden certainly thought so. He and his supporters never failed to describe the war against terrorism as a new crusade against Islam, and Americans particularly as crusaders. And this is not an uncommon view in the Middle East. Muammar Gaddafi has repeatedly, and as recently as August 25th of this year, referred to NATO forces as crusaders and called on all faithful Muslims to rise up against these new crusaders. Ironically, this perspective on the medieval Crusades is actually not far from that of many people in the West. And that is no coincidence. For as I will argue, it is Western culture that has provided Osama bin Laden and Muammar Gaddafi with their own memories of the Crusades. In popular Western culture today, the Crusades are generally remembered as a series of holy wars against Islam, led by power-hungry popes and fought by religious fanatics. They're often described as the epitome of self-righteousness and intolerance, and characterized as a black stain on the history of the Catholic Church in particular, and Western civilization in general. A breed of proto-imperialists, the Crusaders are said to have introduced Western aggression to the peaceful Middle East, and then deformed the Muslim culture, leaving it in ruins. For variations on this theme, one need not look far. You could, for example, see any of these shows, the BBC A&E documentary on the Crusades, which was hosted by Terry Jones of Monty Python fame, or the History Channel's documentary on the Crusades, which I was not in, or The Kingdom of Heaven, the Ridley Scott movie. I wasn't in that either. Indeed, I can think of no popular media portrayal of the Crusades that does not hold in some measure to this view. Yet that's not at all the way that Europeans viewed the Crusades when they were actually happening. Indeed, so far from being an offensive attack on the lands of Islam, Western Christians saw the Crusades as defensive reactions to Muslim aggression. And they had a point. Christians in the 11th century were not paranoid fanatics. There were Muslims really gunning for them. From the time of Muhammad, the Muslim state had very successfully expanded through warfare. Traditional Muslim thought during the Middle Ages divided the world into two spheres, called the abode of Islam and the abode of war. Christianity, and for that matter any other non-Muslim religion, had no abode. Christians and Jews could be tolerated within a Muslim state under Muslim rule, but their states, it was believed, had to be destroyed, and they must be conquered. In the time of Muhammad, in the 7th century, Christianity was the dominant religion of power and wealth, as you can see on this map. As the faith of the Roman Empire, it spanned the entire Mediterranean Sea, including the Middle East, where it was born. The Christian world, therefore, was a prime target for the earliest caliphs, and it would remain so for Muslim leaders for the next 1,000 years. With enormous energy, the warriors of Islam struck out against the Christians shortly after Muhammad's death in 632, and they were extremely successful. Palestine, Syria, Egypt, these were the most heavily Christian areas in the world, quickly succumbed. By the 8th century, Muslim armies had conquered all of Christian North Africa and Spain. In the 11th century, the Seljuk Turks conquered Asia Minor, what is today modern Turkey, which had been Christian since the days of St. Paul. The old Christian Roman Empire, known to modern historians as the Byzantine Empire, was reduced to little more than Greece. In desperation, the emperor in Constantinople sent word to the Christians of Western Europe, asking them to aid their Christian brothers and sisters in the East, or what was left of them. That, in fact, is what gave birth to the Crusades. They were, in essence, a response to more than 4 centuries of conquests in which Muslim armies had already captured 2/3 of the old Christian world. At some point, Christianity as a faith and as a culture either defended itself or was subsumed by Islam. The Crusades were that defense. Pope Urban II called the Knights of Christendom to push back the conquests of Islam at the Council of Clermont in 1095. The response was tremendous. Many thousands of warriors took the vow of the cross and prepared for war. Why did they do it? The answer to that question has been badly misunderstood over the years. It was once believed by historians that crusaders were lacklands and ne'er-do-wells who took advantage of the situation to rob and to pillage in faraway lands. Many high school and college textbooks continue to present crusaders in just this way. However, during the past 2 decades, computer-assisted charter studies have proved this to be wrong. Scholars have discovered that crusading knights were generally very wealthy men, with plenty of their own land in Europe. Nevertheless, they spent enormous sums to undertake the crusading mission. Crusading was not cheap. Even wealthy lords could easily impoverish themselves and their families by joining a crusade. They did so not simply because they expected material wealth, which they had already in abundance, but because they hoped to store up treasure where rust and moth could not corrupt. These were professional warriors who were keenly aware of their own sinfulness and the sinfulness inherent in their profession, and they were willing to undertake the hardships of the crusade as what they saw as a penitential act of charity and of love. Europe is littered with thousands of medieval charters attesting to precisely these sentiments, in which these men and women still speak to us today. Now, of course, these crusaders were not opposed to capturing booty if it could be had. But the truth is that the Crusades were notoriously bad for plunder. A few people got rich, but the vast majority returned with nothing. Indeed, many did not return at all. Approximately 1 out of every 2 crusaders died on the journey. Urban II gave the Crusaders 2 goals, both of which would remain central to the Eastern Crusades for centuries. The first was to redeem the Christians of the East. As his successor, Pope Innocent II, later wrote, these are the Pope's words, "How does a man love, according to divine precept, his neighbor as himself, when knowing that his Christian brothers in faith and in name are held by the perfidious Muslims in strict confinement and weighed down by the yoke of heaviest servitude, he does not devote himself to the task of freeing them? Is it by chance that you do not know that many thousands of Christians are bound in slavery and imprisoned by the Muslims, tortured with innumerable torments?" End quote. Jonathan Riley Smith of Cambridge University has rightly argued that crusading was seen as an act of love. In this case, the love of one's neighbor. The crusade was seen as an errand of mercy to right a terrible wrong. As the Pope later wrote to the Knights Templar, quote, "You carry out in deeds the words of the gospel, greater love than this hath no man, that he lay down his life for his friends." End quote. The second goal was the liberation of Jerusalem and the other places made holy by the life of Christ. The word crusade, cruzada, is a modern one. Medieval crusaders saw themselves as pilgrims to the Holy Sepulchre. The crusade indulgence that they received was canonically related to the pilgrimage indulgence. In medieval society, it's not surprising then that this goal was frequently described in feudal terms. For example, when calling the Fifth Crusade in 1215, Pope Innocent III wrote the following. These are the Pope's words. "Consider, most dear sons, consider carefully that if any temporal king was thrown out of his domain and perhaps captured, would he not, when he was restored to his liberty and the time had come for dispensing justice, look on his vassals as unfaithful and as traitors, unless they had committed not only their property, but also their lives to the task of freeing him? And similarly, will not Jesus Christ, the King of kings and Lord of lords, whose servant you cannot deny being, who joined your soul to your body, who redeemed you with his precious blood, condemn you for the vice of ingratitude and the crime of infidelity, if you neglect to help him?" The reconquest of Jerusalem, therefore, was understood by medieval Christians as an act of restoration and an open declaration of one's love of God. Now, medieval people knew, of course, that God had the power to restore Jerusalem himself, indeed restore the whole world to his rule. Yet, as St. Bernard of Clairvaux preached, he did not do so as a blessing to his people. Bernard wrote, "Again I say, consider the Almighty's goodness and pay heed to his plans of mercy. He puts himself under obligation to you, or rather, he pretends to do so, that he can help you to satisfy your obligations to himself. I call blessed this generation that can seize an opportunity of such rich indulgence as this." In medieval Europe, crusades to the east were universally seen as acts of a tremendous good. And how could they not? A crusader was one who, at great expense and personal peril, sought to rescue the downtrodden, defend the defenseless, and restore to Christendom what had been violently taken away. A crusade indulgence, then, was a formal recognition of the penitential component of these actions. Crusaders were sinners. They undertook the crusade not only to defend their world, but also to atone for their sins. By the nature of their profession, warriors put their souls at risk. The crusade, therefore, was a means for them to save their souls. And that was no small thing. In the medieval world, where death was always near at hand, the salvation of one's soul meant everything. It was a matter of constant concern for low and high life. By any reckoning, the First Crusade was a long shot. There was no leader, no chain of command, no supply lines, no real strategy at all. It was simply thousands of warriors marching deep into enemy territory, committed to a common cause. Many of them died, either in battle or through disease or starvation. It was a rough campaign, one that seemed always on the brink of disaster. Yet it was astonishingly successful. By 1098, the Crusaders had restored Nicaea and the great city of Antioch to Christian rule. In July 1099, they had conquered Jerusalem itself and began to build a new Christian state in Palestine. The joy in Europe was unbridled. It seemed that the tide of history, which had lifted the Muslims to such great heights, was at last turning. But in truth, it was not. When we think about the Middle Ages, it's easy to view Europe in light of what it became rather than what it was. The colossus of the medieval world was Islam, not Christendom. The Crusades are interesting because they were an attempt to counter that trend. But it is still true that in 5 centuries of crusading, it was only the first crusade that significantly rolled back the military progress of Islam in the East. It was all downhill from there. Once the Muslim states in the region unified against the Kingdom of Jerusalem, it was doomed. If the Crusades represented the highest good, how could they fail? If Crusaders fought for God, then why did the victories go to their enemies? These were questions that vexed Christians in the Middle Ages. The answers lay no further than their Bible. The ancient Israelites, God's chosen people, had frequently been defeated by other godless people. It was not because God had abandoned them or because he favored the foreigners. Instead, he used those defeats as a means of chastising his people for their sins. Europeans took their defeats at the hands of Muslims as clear evidence of their own sinfulness. This led to renewed attempts to purify the church and all of Christian society throughout the Middle Ages. Success in the Crusades became the barometer of the soul of Christendom. When they succeeded, God was once again pleased with his people. The problem was, they never succeeded. The last Christian outpost in the Holy Land fell in 1291. In subsequent centuries, the dramatic growth of Muslim power, particularly under the Ottoman Empire, as you see here, spelled only further defeats for the West. By the 14th century, the Crusades were no longer wars to turn back Muslim conquests in faraway lands, but they were desperate and largely unsuccessful attempts to defend Europe itself against Muslim invasion. By the 16th century, the Ottoman Turks had conquered all of the Middle East and North Africa and southeastern Europe, including areas today that are Greece, Bulgaria, Albania, Hungary, and elsewhere. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent came within a hair's breadth of conquering Vienna, which, if he had conquered Vienna, would have left all of Germany at his mercy. Vienna was saved by a freak rainstorms, not the Crusades. It was in the 16th century, when Western Europe was in the gravest danger of Muslim conquest, that the Crusades as an institution began to collapse utterly. There are many reasons for this. As secular authority in Europe increased, religious unity crumbled. Europeans began dividing themselves now along political lines. In addition, there was a strong desire in the West for church reform. Reformers invariably criticized doctrines that were central to crusading. In particular, the secular authority of the Pope and the doctrine of indulgence. With the spread of the Protestant Reformation, crusading was henceforth viewed along confessional lines. Protestants, like Martin Luther, condemned the Crusades as a tool of a corrupt papacy. Yet even Protestants had to reckon with the awesome power of the Turks and the danger that that power posed to Christian Europe. If the Crusades were morally bankrupt, as the Protestants insisted, how then could Europeans unite to defend against their common enemy? For 1,000 years after the death of the Prophet, Muslim armies had managed to conquer fully 3/4 of the old Christian world, despite the efforts of generations of crusaders to halt or to turn back that advance. An impartial observer at the time might well have concluded that Christendom was a doomed remnant of the ancient Roman Empire, destined to be supplanted by the more youthful and energetic religion and culture of Islam. Yet that observer would have been wrong. Within Europe, new ideas were brewing that would have dramatic and unprecedented repercussions. not just in the Mediterranean, but across the entire world. Born out of a unique blend of faith and reason, individualism and entrepreneurialism, those ideas produced a rapid, unprecedentedly rapid increase in scientific experimentation with immediately practical applications. By the 17th century, things had changed so much that European wealth and power were growing exponentially. Europeans were entering a new and completely unprecedented age. It is one of the most remarkable events in history that the Christian West, an internally divided region seemingly on the brink of conquest by a powerful empire, suddenly burst forth with amazing new energy, neutralizing its enemies and expanding all across the globe. The specter of advancing Muslim armies, which for centuries had posed such dangers to the Christian West, no longer constituted a serious threat at all. Indeed, as the gaze of Europeans spanned new global horizons, they soon forgot that such a threat had existed. The Muslim world was no longer viewed as a dread enemy, but instead was seen as simply one more backward culture. From that perspective, the medieval Crusades began to seem distant and unnecessary, a discarded artifact from the childhood of a civilization. The 18th century saw the rise of the Enlightenment, with its strict emphasis on rational thought, religious toleration, and anti-clericalism. In an intellectual atmosphere like that, the medieval Crusades were not going to be remembered very well. Indeed, Enlightenment historians like Voltaire and Edward Gibbon viewed the Middle Ages as a pool of ignorance and superstition and fanaticism that stood between them and the glories of the ancient world. Not surprisingly, they saw the Crusades and described them as a bizarre manifestation of medieval barbarism, in which thousands of the deceived and the foolish marched through rivers of blood in a pitiful attempt to save their souls. In his famous book, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Gibbon insisted that nothing good at all came out of the Crusades, except perhaps Europe's exposure to more sophisticated Eastern cultures. During the 19th century, the Crusades were rehabilitated by the Romantic movement, which adored everything medieval, and also the new ideologies, 19th century ideologies of nationalism and imperialism. French nationalists, for example, saw their country as both the cultural epicenter and the natural leader of Europe. The French proudly look back on their medieval crusades, born and nurtured in medieval France, as a clear example of their country's greatness. When the French invaded and conquered Algeria in 1830, the campaign was widely described as a successor to St. Louis IX's crusade to Tunisia in 1270. However, the Crusades were being refashioned in the 19th century to become something that they never were. In this case, France's first attempt to bring the fruits of Western civilization to the Muslim world. As such, the new, improved Crusades were retooled to become the first chapter in European colonialism. This worked well, since all of the European colonial powers could boast famous crusaders in their histories. Germany had Frederick Barbarossa, England had Richard the Lionheart, whose statue is right outside of Parliament still today, and even tiny Belgium had Godfrey de Bouillon. The aftermath of World War I brought about the fall of the once mighty Ottoman Empire, the last great Muslim state. In dividing up the remains of the Ottoman Empire, the League of Nations gave control of Palestine and Syria to Britain and France. Now steeped in all of these imagined medieval precedents, Europeans could scarcely have avoided seeing this new colonialism as the final chapter in the long history of the Crusades. For example, the popular London magazine, Punch, ran a drawing of Richard the Lionheart watching the British entry into Jerusalem. And the caption on the cartoon read, "At last, my dream come true." Similarly, after taking command in Syria, the French general Henri Gourand remarked as his soldiers walked into Damascus, "Behold, Saladin, we have returned." It is commonly said that memories in the Middle East are long, and that although the Crusades may have been forgotten in the West, they are still vividly remembered where they happened. For example, in a speech delivered at Georgetown University a few weeks after the 9/11 attacks, former President Bill Clinton said, quote, "Those of us who come from various European lineages are not blameless. Indeed, in the First Crusade, when the Christian soldiers took Jerusalem, they first burned a synagogue with 300 Jews in it, and proceeded to kill every woman and child who was Muslim on the Temple Mount. The contemporaneous descriptions of the event describe soldiers walking on the Temple Mount, a place holy to Christians, with blood running up to their knees. I can tell you that that story is still being told today in the Middle East, and we are still paying for it." End quote. The president is correct that the story is still told, but it is neither accurate nor is it a long-held memory of a traumatic event. Indeed, the simple and startling fact is that the Crusades were virtually unknown in the Muslim world even a century ago. The term for the Crusades in Arabic, Arab as-Salayy, was only introduced into the Arabic language in the mid-19th century. Before that, there was no Arabic word for crusade. The first Arabic history of the Crusades was not written until 1899. In other words, 100 or so years ago, no one at all in the Middle East was telling the president's story. How was that possible? How could Muslims not remember centuries of Christian holy wars that were waged against them? Well, it must be remembered that although the Crusades were of monumental importance to Europeans, they were a very minor, largely insignificant thing to the vast Muslim world. Traditionally, Muslims took very little interest in people or events outside of the abode of Islam, the Dar al-Islam. There was therefore nothing to differentiate the Crusades from any other of the numerous and nearly constant wars against infidels. The Crusades were in any case unsuccessful and thus irrelevant. A Western traveler in the 18th century would have been hard-pressed to find a Muslim anywhere in the Middle East who had ever heard of the Crusades. Even in the 19th century, they were known only to a handful of intellectuals. In the grand sweep of Islamic history, the Crusades simply did not matter. Muslim perceptions of their own history changed in the 20th century. Rescued from obscurity, the Crusades were discovered and given a place of importance that they had never enjoyed before. The long memory of the Crusades in the Muslim Middle East is in fact a constructed memory, one in which the memory is much younger than the event itself. How did this come about? Well, as we have seen, when European colonial powers took control of the Middle East in the wake of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, they brought with them a concept of the Crusades and an understanding of their own actions within that medieval context. In books and colonial schools, Europeans taught the Muslim world about the Crusades. The Crusades in those books were vividly described as heroic enterprises whose aim, like those of the modern-day Europeans, was to bring civilization to the Middle East. It was also at this time that Saladin was reintroduced to the Muslim world. Hard as it may be to believe, the famous Sultan had been virtually forgotten in the Middle East. But on further reflection, this should not be too surprising. Saladin was a Kurd, not an Arab, an ethnic group that was not well liked by either the Arabs or the Turks, and still isn't. Although Saladin had won the Battle of Hattin in 1187 and subsequently conquered Jerusalem and much of the Crusader kingdom, Saladin's successes, as well as his dynasty, was short-lived. The Third Crusade managed to erase most of his conquests. Even Jerusalem would not remain permanently in Muslim hands. Saladin may have been forgotten in the Middle East, but he was very well remembered in Western Europe. In part, this was because his manners and his actions seemed to have much in common with the chivalric knight. There is no doubt that Richard the Lionheart thought highly of Saladin. This made him a perfect foil for the celebrated Crusader king, the Lionheart, and he therefore figured prominently in medieval romances. In time, Western storytellers would have Saladin being knighted and even secretly converting to Christianity. In medieval Venice, the name Saladin had a brief period of popularity for Christian boys. It was this idealized Saladin, the noble warrior, merciful ruler, and great unifier, that modern Europeans brought with them when they returned to the Middle East in the early 20th century. This occurred very dramatically, in fact, in 1899, when Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany visited the neglected and largely forgotten tomb of Saladin in Damascus. Shocked at the poor state of the tomb, Wilhelm paid for the creation of an entirely new mausoleum on which he placed this bronze wreath with the inscription, "From one great emperor to another." Two main groups in the Middle East, nationalists and Islamists, stood in opposition to European colonialism in the Middle East in the 20th century. Nationalists demanded sovereign states independent of European rule. Islamists looked to the Quran and Islamic history, insisting that Muslims must renew the jihad and restore the unity of the Dar al-Islam. Nationalists and Islamists were naturally antagonistic to each other, yet they both shared a common desire to eject European powers from the Middle East. Since the colonialists had themselves equated their occupation with the medieval Crusades, it was natural enough for Muslims then, and especially Arabs, to do the same. This became particularly pronounced after the creation of the State of Israel, which Arabs contended was a new Crusader kingdom. The fact that Israel was Jewish was irrelevant. It was still a non-Muslim state planted on the former lands of the Crusaders. By the 1950s, colonialism was largely discredited in the West. In the United States and in Britain, intellectuals began to calculate the harm done to the world by the legacy of imperialism. The Crusades, which had now been redefined as the West's first colonial venture, were tarred with the same brush. They were, it was argued, nothing more than destructive wars of greed, cynically covered in a thin veneer of pious platitudes. Indeed, so great was this feeling, primarily among Western elites and intellectuals, that a large number of them took part in a walk in the footsteps of the First Crusade on the 900th anniversary in 1999. The purpose of this reconciliation walk was to apologize to everyone in the Middle East for the Crusades and their continued legacy. They gave Muslims, when they met them, a signed apology. and it read, quote, 900 years ago, our forefathers carried the name of Jesus Christ in battle across the Middle East. Fueled by fear, greed, and hatred, they betrayed the name of Christ. We deeply regret the atrocities committed in the name of Christ. Where they were motivated by hatred and prejudice, we offer you love and brotherhood. End quote. Arab nationalists and Islamists agreed fully with this interpretation of the Crusades. Poverty, corruption, and violence in the Middle East were said to be the lingering effects of the Crusades and then subsequent European imperialism. The Muslim world had failed to keep up with the West because it had been dealt a debilitating blow by the Crusaders, a blow that was repeated by the European descendants in the 19th century, or so it was said. The dictators that ruled the now independent Arab states seized on this as a means of deflecting criticism from their own regimes. Generations of Arab school children have been taught that the Crusades were a clear case of good versus evil. Rapacious and zealous crusaders swept into a peaceful and sophisticated Muslim world, leaving carnage and destruction in their wake. Yet, Saladin, the great and heroic leader, led the Muslims to victory, capturing Jerusalem and defeating the invaders. Not surprisingly, Arab leaders today continue to invoke this recovered memory of Saladin. For example, in 1992, the Syrian leader, Hafez Assad, placed a life-size equestrian statue of Saladin, complete with defeated Crusader lords groveling below, directly in front of the Damascus citadel, not 100 yards away from a massive portrait of Assad himself. A depiction of the statue even appears on the Syrian currency. The former president of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, regularly referred to himself as a new Saladin who would unite the Arab world against their common foes, even though Saladin was no Arab. Today, many Islamists believe that the West, and in particular the United States, is prosecuting a new crusade, one that is being fought on many fronts. American military bases, especially those in Muslim countries, are described as the return of Crusader forces. For example, when Osama bin Laden issued his declaration of jihad on February 23, 1998, he did so against, quote, the Jews and the Crusaders. He wrote, quote, the Arabian Peninsula has never, since Allah made it flat, created its desert, and encircled it with seas, been stormed by any forces like the Crusader armies spreading in it like locusts, end quote. The attack on the United States, therefore, on September 11, 2001, was viewed by Islamists as an act of jihad against a crusading state. It was a new battle of Hattin, a new field of blood. When the United States declared war on Afghanistan and Islamist terrorism, European countries rose up in support. This, too, the Islamists viewed through the prism of the Crusades. In an October 2001 Al Jazeera interview, bin Laden remarked, quote, this is a recurring war. The original Crusades were brought by Richard from Britain, Louis from France, and Barbarossa from Germany. Today, the crusading countries rushed as soon as Bush raised the cross. They accepted the rule of the cross. In Amin Malouk's popular book, The Crusades Through Arab Eyes, published in 1984, he asked the question, can we go so far as to claim that the Crusades marked the beginning of Western Europe, of the rise of Western Europe, which would gradually come to dominate the world, and sounded the death knell of Arab civilization? And with some qualifications, he answers in the affirmative. He writes, although the epic of the Crusades ignited a genuine economic and cultural revolution in Western Europe, in the Orient, these holy wars led to long centuries of decadence and obscurantism. Assaulted from all quarters, the Muslim world turned in on itself. He goes on, there can be no doubt that the schism between these two worlds dates from the Crusades, deeply felt by the Arabs, even today, as an act of rape. Now, Malouf, who is a novelist, offers a conclusion that is perfectly in keeping with the modern popular consensus in both the Middle East and, I would argue, the West. Popular it may be, yet it is nonetheless wrong. Scholars have long argued that the Crusades had no beneficial effect on Europe's economy. Indeed, they constituted a massive drain on European resources. The rise of population and wealth in Europe predated the Crusades. Indeed, they allowed the Crusades to happen at all. Rather than decadent or assaulted on all sides, the Muslim world was growing to ever new heights of power and prosperity long after the destruction of the Crusader states in 1291. It was the Muslim world, under the rule of the Ottoman sultans, that would invade Western Europe, seriously threatening the survival of the last remnant of Christendom. The Crusades contributed nothing to the decline of the Muslim world. That is very clearly evidenced just by this map. Indeed, they're evidence of the decline of the Christian West, which was forced to mount these desperate expeditions to defend against an ever-expanding Muslim empire. Returning to the question with which I began, are the Crusades to blame for the current tensions between Islam and the West? The simple answer is no. The Crusades were a medieval phenomenon, a part of a medieval world that is very different than our world today. Christians saw the Crusades to the east as religious wars waged in the defense of Christendom. For their part, medieval Muslims had no understanding or interest in the Crusades. The Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem was simply one more state in an already chaotic political landscape. When the Muslims of the region finally united, they dispatched the infidels, and that was all. The Crusader states were simply a tiny crumb in the big soup of Islamic history. It is not the Crusades that led to the attacks 10 years ago, but an artificial memory of the Crusades, constructed by modern colonial European powers and passed down by Arab nationalists and Islamists. The new memory strips the medieval expeditions of every aspect of their age, dressing them up instead in the tattered rags of 19th century imperialism. The Crusades have thus become an icon for modern agendas that medieval Christians and Muslims could scarcely have understood, let alone condoned. Muchas gracias.